website after, and there is the hint. If you just say got it, you will be able to review this later. So tonight, please join me in welcoming Jillian Kreinbring to discuss dressage through the lens of biomechanics. Jillian has been working with horses her entire life. As head trainer at Circle L Ranch in Germany, she trained client horses, started young stock, and exhibited halter and pleasure horses, not courses, horses. While abroad, she won 3 European National Halter Championships, the Circle L Western Pleasure Futurity, and High Point DQHA Horse of the Year, and trained AQHA World Qualifiers. Jillian came back to the US and completed her master's in equine management at the School of Agricultural Life Sciences at the University of Wisconsin Madison. Here she studied equine movement, posture, and muscle development, as well as adult vocational education. Supported and guided by Dr. Hilary Clayton, Dr. Nancy Nicholson, and Dr. Sara Wyche, Jillian completed her master's thesis entitled Desired Muscular Development in the Neck of the Horse, an Equine Observational Communication Tool and Study. Additionally, Jillian has spent time with Dr. Deb Bennett studying gross anatomy at the School of Equinology. Jillian's deep concern for the health of horses fuels her ongoing study of classical riding and its relationship to sound functional anatomy and posture and well-being. She continues her riding and in-hand education with Manolo Mendez, Stephanie Millham, and Peggy Cummings. Prior to his death in 2016, Jillian studied extensively with Mark Russell. Now she will share with us why we do what we do in the saddle. Jillian, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Well, it is a great honor for me to be able to present to NEDA because you have offered so many wonderful educational opportunities for so many years, and never did I ever think that I would be one of those people presenting. So thank you very much for having me. I wanted just to expand first a little bit about how it is that I've come to be so passionate about what I study, research, and teach. And it really started for me when I was living and training in Germany. And even though I was working with Western horses, it was during that time that I was introduced to classical dressage principles. I was, 21 years old and, thought I knew a lot more than what I really did know. But I started to realize that the German competitors that had made the transition from dressage to reining seemed to have a competitive edge. And upon observing their training practices, I noticed that they were taking a much different approach than some of the techniques and methodologies that I had learned here in the States. And I could see that the horses just were developing in a way that actually enhanced the quality of their movement as opposed to balling them up and training them more from a sense of learned helplessness. And so that was really a major turning point for me. And I knew then that my own training practices were really based in dominance and subjugation. And that just didn't feel right to me. And so I packed my bags up and I moved back to the United States, where I embarked on a completely different type of education. And when I moved back to the States, in that first year, I unfortunately had a riding accident and I broke my back. And while I was waiting there for the ambulance, I had an epiphany. And it was really a life transformational experience for me, because as I was waiting for the ambulance to come pick me up in the middle of a field, I really realized at the ripe old age of 23 that I really didn't know anything about horses. I didn't know anything about who they are as a species. And I realized that up to that point that I was really driven by my ego. You know, I was really mostly concerned about what people thought of me and how I would do in the competition arena. And having that accident kind of, for me, it was like my worst fear coming true, which was that I wasn't really good at what I loved so much, which was training and being with horses. And so that accident was a gift in that it changed my perspective. It changed my paradigm into becoming passionate about learning about who the horses are as a species. And that reaches far, far, far beyond the skeletal system and the muscular system and the fascia and the ligaments and the tendons and all of the functional anatomy, which is super, super important. But you can't ferret or tease apart the body from the mind. So there are some training techniques that, or methodologies that believe you get to the body through the mind. And then there are others that believe you get to the mind through the body, or the mind, or the body through the mind. And the truth of the matter is that both is true. So even though tonight we're going to be talking about functional anatomy, just know that that's just one sliver of the pie, right? There's so much more to consider beyond the scope of even functional anatomy. And tonight, I spent some time thinking about what I was going to present when Karen approached me. And I thought, well, I feel like I want it to be something slightly different than what I present in my functional anatomy course that I teach, you know, at facilities around the country, which is a whole weekend course. And I thought that perhaps I was speaking to a fairly educated audience. So I wanted to delve in a little deeper. So tonight I'm going to just briefly and simply introduce some basic spinal mechanisms that we all need to be familiar with as we school our horses in dressage. But beyond the bones in the spine and the muscles, what really operates that? Well, what really operates that is the horse's neurology and how the horse gathers information from the external environment that plays a very important role in how we go about educating our horses. So that's what I'm going to bring to you all tonight. And again, it's not going to be super complex because we just lack the time to do so. But I sure hope that it will pique your curiosity and maybe open a different kind of lens for you the next time you go out and spend time with your horses. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up the PowerPoint. Does that work okay for all?
Absolutely. Go right ahead. I'm just making.
All right. So I'm going to go here to share my screen. Okay. I'm going to go to my desktop. Having here, let me see. Have to move a few little things around here to get to where I want to go. All right, and share. Very good. Now, can you all see my screen okay?
Yep, we see the full screen. Perfect.
I was going to put my glasses on because, you know, I'm over 40 now. So just last week, I graduated to progressive lenses.
Boy.
And I'm not quite, I haven't quite figured out how to do it, but I realize I'm now my mother. How she used to like hold her head up and look down. I get it now, Mom. But I'm not used to them enough to use them tonight. So if I'm squinting, it's because I can't see.
Well, next time we'll expect the full show with the glasses.
All right, that's good. All right, so much about what we want to accomplish with our horses comes back to posture. And so tonight's lecture is entitled Dynamic Posture, Finding the Balance. And I would like to spend a little bit of time just explaining what the heck I mean by dynamic posture. So the first thing we're going to look at, or the first concepts that we're going to cover, are basically what are and what creates healthy dynamic postures. Once that we've covered a few slides talking about what a dynamic posture is, then I'm going to move on to how are these postures created and influenced by the external environment in our training programs. And when we start talking about that, we are going to talk about the 6 senses. And the 6th of the 6 senses is what's referred to as proprioception. And it really lies at the heart of what we want to accomplish with our horses. The ability to create that unspoken, beautiful dance that we share with horses in a very artful and healthy and beautiful way. Okay, so let's look at dynamic posture. I'm going to move a few things around here. Okay. Dynamic posture is exactly what the word implies. It's dynamic. So when you talk about horses being on the forehand or horses working in a degree of collection, whether it's a basic state of balance or a horse that's just starting to find collection, beginnings of collection, all the way up to a high level or a high degree of collection. What that means is that all of those postures that we are looking to attain from our horses is dictated by how the horse uses his or her spine. And the horse makes changes to the shape of their spine constantly. Yet so many times when we're taking lessons from our instructors, when the horse comes into that nice place, the instructor says, "Now hold him there." Well, that's kind of a contradiction, because if you try to hold your horse in a static posture while he's moving, it is simply over time going to create bracing patterns and compensatory patterns. So posture is always changing. It's extremely dynamic. And we all know this because in one stride, the horse can be on the forehand, and the next stride, he can be balanced. In the next stride, he can be a little on the forehand, and in the next stride, slightly collected. So it's always changing. And the masters of yesteryear and of today always talk about the importance of allowing the spine to act like an accordion, where you bring your horse together and you let him out. Just like a beautiful musical composition where you crescendo and you let it come down, and it adds life and feel and body and correctness to the music and to the motion, right? So posture. Posture is a complex process dictated essentially by how the horse uses his or her spine and limbs upon proprioceptive inputs to the brain from sensory organs. What? So that simply means that the horse is receiving information from the external environment that helps us communicate to the horse to teach him and to educate him to use his body in a particular way, okay? So there is a biomechanical law that we sometimes aren't aware of because we become very focused on what's happening with the horse's legs. But the truth of the matter is that it is spinal dynamics that govern limb dynamics. So it is truly the spine of the horse that we ride, and it is the spine of the horse that we want to help the horse change the shape of to come into what is referred to as a weight-bearing posture. Okay? So when horses are educated well, both mentally and physically, they develop the ability to move in these dynamic postures. And these dynamic postures, which essentially are postures that bring the spine into flexion or into varying degrees of bascule. And in these postures, it makes it easiest for the horse to carry the vertical forces of the rider on their horizontal plane, which is their back. Okay, so in my functional anatomy class, we talk all about all the different things that the horses have to do in certain regions of his or her body to produce these postures. So I don't have time to go through all of those. So we're going to look at it from a different angle. Okay. And again, if y'all have any questions, please just shout them out and I'll do my best to answer them. But I'm just like all of you. Whatever I teach tonight is truth for the moment, meaning I might learn something new tomorrow that would completely change my perspective. So tonight you're getting my truth for the moment. Well, I'm having some trouble here. How do I go to my next slide? There we go. All right, I gotta go back one more. Okay, so let's talk just a tad about spinal mobility. And what does the spine have to do to come into these dynamic postures that we're so eager to teach our horses? Well, the spine of the horse and of ourselves, for that matter, moves in a very multi-dimensional way. Oftentimes, we think very simply about how the horse uses his or her back and neck, but it's not really all that simple. It's not a two-dimensional object. The horse is a multi-dimensional sentient being, okay? So when the spine moves, the spine can produce what is referred to as lateral flexion or side bending, okay? And you can see in the graphic an example of lateral bending. Sometimes people will call that the sideways banana. You want the horse to bend from the pole to the tail, okay? So when a horse produces that movement, he will create in his spine, some areas more than others, what's referred to as a lateral flexion or side bending. So if you have the vertebrae aligned this way, this would create a lateral flexion or a lateral bend. Okay, so horses can bend to the right and they can bend to the left. And these are the things that we want the horse to do when we're riding him on a circle or bended lines, such as serpentines and so forth. Okay, now the horse also can move his spine in dorsal ventral actions. Okay, so if we use layman terms, that simply means that the horse can extend his spine as well as flex his spine. Okay, so we have flexion and extension as well as side bending. Okay, now the one that doesn't get talked about as frequently is what is referred to as axial rotation. And that's a very, very important concept to understand if you truly want to understand how a horse bends from the pole to the tail. Because in actuality, the horse does not have the ability to create side bending in his body more than 6 to 8 inches in the thoracic spine and the lumbar spine, okay? So when the horse creates a lateral bend, it is always, if the horse is moving without compensation, it is always coupled with what's referred to as axial rotation. Okay, so when a horse produces side bending and a axial rotation, you will have what appears to be the C bend that we are all trying to help educate our horses to do, so that we have access to the inside hind leg to create more bend and push off, okay? And we're going to talk more about this axial rotation in the next couple slides. And lastly, we have what is simply referred to as a neutral posture. Neutral posture gets thrown about all over the place. But essentially what neutral posture is neutral posture is a resting posture. And when a horse is in neutral posture, he is neither flexed nor extended, nor is he creating a side bend with axial rotation. And when a horse is in a neutral posture, it enables horses to make any desired movement possibility with ease. And so many of you may have learned about your own neutral posture when riding, which gives you the most ease of motion with your own limbs, which helps you to develop your own independent seat. It's very important, okay? So let's take a little bit of a closer look.
There is one question in the chat so far. Is it possible to hurt the horse through overbending?
Yes. My goodness, what a great, great question. Okay, so the most mobile part of the horse's spine is his neck. And I'm very, very passionate about the horse's neck because I believe it's one of the most misunderstood parts of the horse's body. And unfortunately, it is also the most abused. So coming from the Western world, I have seen and still see repeatedly, constantly, all the time, are people who believe that they will create suppleness by tying the horse's head around. Okay, that will never create true suppleness. What that will create is hypermobility. And hypermobility is in actuality a weakness, because what it does is it destabilizes the joints. And when joints are destabilized, they create shear forces. And those shear forces can lead to bony changes, or otherwise known as arthritis. So in the Western world, when people overbend laterally, I refer to that simply as lateral roll curve. And not only does it create hypermobility and shearing in the cervical vertebrae, but it will also interfere with the very things that we want to create, which is balance, right? So when a horse is correctly balanced, he can balance himself from the forehand to the hindquarters more efficiently to carry more weight. But he also needs to be able to have the ability to balance himself laterally from side to side. So if you overbend, what happens to the shoulder? The energy exits through the outside shoulder, and therefore the horse is no longer laterally balanced, okay? So we can do overbending in a multitude of ways. Like I just said, we can overdo it laterally, which is what I refer to as lateral roll curve, or we can do it vertically, which is also an overflexion of the neck. And we have to remember that the neck has 7 cervical vertebrae. And in between each one of those cervical vertebrae, there is a joint. So when we think about bending the neck, we just only think of it bending either too much vertically or sideways. We think about it as just one unit. But you have to remember there's a joint in between every one of those vertebrae. So you can have completely different shearing forces going on in the neck. It doesn't just bend in a uniform way. So yes, you can overbend laterally, and that can create hypermobility, and the hypermobility can lead to osteoarthritis. Okay, so it was a great question. Any more questions?
Not as of yet. I know the one that's coming is going to be, is there a visual guideline to avoid the overbending? Is it different for each horse? How can you tell when you've reached the limit?
Mm-hmm. That again is a fabulous question. Yes, horses are all different. Now, horses essentially all have the same anatomy, but their anatomy can be arranged in different ways, which is what creates different looks in horses, okay? So we can have slight variations. Now, the rule of thumb that I was always taught by my teachers is that you do not want to bend the neck beyond the point of the horse's shoulder or the point of the shoulder. Okay. And one of the easiest ways to see if a horse is overbending is either A, you will lose the energy out the shoulder. And we have to remember that training and riding horses is all about the shaping of energy, right? It's the constant dance of shaping and reshaping energy and recycling energy. So if you overbend and you create a kink at the base of the neck, the energy has to exit somewhere. So oftentimes it will exit out the shoulder and the horse will lose the shoulder to the outside, or if you're counter bending, the horse will fall to the inside, okay? So that's one way of being able to recognize it. Another way of being able to recognize it is if the neck is being overbent and he's not bending laterally through the entire body, he will shear his outside leg on a curved line and step wide. So again, that's why it's important to be there with your outside leg to help to encourage the horse to keep the hindquarters on track. Otherwise, he'll just create almost and can, unfortunately, create a 90-degree angle at the junction between the base of the neck and the shoulders, which is just wrong all the way around, okay? So yes, I always try to look for the point of the shoulder. In some horses, it's even a little less. My teacher, Manolo Mendez, is always teaching his students, you're overbending the horse. You're laterally overbending the horse. And again, it will disrupt the horse's balance. Okay.
There's a question in the chat now that I got privately just regarding in dressage, our wonderful focus on the circles. And if we stay on this natural curve through the whole body, the head does not exceed the point of the shoulder. Is that correct? Or can the circles become dangerous at any point?
Yeah, I think anything overdone is dangerous, right? And again, just to refer back to my teacher, Manolo, he always would say to me, Jillian, if all you do is try to perfect the 20-meter trot circle, your horse is only going to get more and more and more stiff, right? Which is why we go back to being dynamic, right? That's why the gymnasticizing of lateral exercises are so tried and true, right? And it's because you want to help the horse learn actually through non-habitual movement patterns. Because if you get stuck constantly in habitual movement patterns, you can liken it to working in a factory and making this motion all day long, right? Well, over time, you're going to start getting wear and tear in your rotator cuff. It's the same for horses. We want to constantly be introducing them to non-habitual movement patterns and changes in their environment altogether when we're riding them, which is where we're going in terms of proprioception. Okay. So coming back to basic spinal postures. these are just some simple graphics for you to get a visual. The top graphic is a horse standing in neutral posture. When the horse is not compensating and is true in his neutral posture, both his cannon bones in the hind and the front legs will be perpendicular to the ground, because those bones are designed for a purpose, and that is to take weight from gravity and motion in general. So when a horse is in a healthy, correct neutral posture, both the hind and back cannon bones will be perpendicular to the ground. The spine will not be flexed or extended or side bended, or there will be no sense of axial rotation, but just simply in a neutral posture, which makes him ready for any movement that he might have to make, okay? The next posture you see is flexed. It's simply a horse flexing his spine or coming round. And below we have your basic extended spine where he's hollowing his back. I like to refer to that as a bad banana. And unfortunately, if you are riding in this posture, which we see all the time because people tend to compress the neck and the back drops, we affectionately refer to that posture as the rider riding in the pit of despair. Bad news bears, okay? Now we're gonna move over to a beautiful graphic by the late Dr. Nancy Nicholson. And the pictures, by the way, on the left are some of the last pictures drawn by a wonderful friend and wonderful horsewoman, Susan Harris. So I feel very blessed to have some of Susan's last drawings that she did for me. So quite an amazing human being. So here on the right, we have a picture of a horse that is moving in lateral bending, okay? So there's a second part to this, as I had already said, is that lateral bending, when done correctly, is always coupled with what is referred to as axial rotation, okay? So let's take a peek at axial rotation. All right. Now, I'm going to leave this slide up here for a while so that you can study it, because it can be a slightly confusing concept to wrap around in our brain. Jean-Luc Cornille, who is another anatomist and biomechanics specialist, does a very good job of explaining how lateral flexion and axial rotation are coupled. So I will do my best to try to explain it on one slide, okay? So again, when we're working horses and we're educating them to move in dynamic postures, we want horses moving with a flexed spine, with the correct lateral side bending and rotation. Now, in some of the literature that you might read, or you may have heard it at some point in your studies, is that we want to teach our horses to move from a lateral to a longitudinal bend, or lateral to longitudinal. So what that essentially means is that the side bend will help produce this bend. Okay, so lateral side bending helps to produce bascule, or flexion of the spine. Okay, so flexion, lateral side bending, and axial rotation of the spine is otherwise known as lateral to longitudinal spinal mobility. These spinal mechanics aid horses in balancing both from side to side, that lateral balance, as well as the balance from the front to the back. We need all of these multidimensional movement patterns to be happening, okay? So the use of the spine in this way brings about varying degrees of vascule or roundness. And this lifts the horses back into a weight-bearing posture when working on circles and bended lines. And we want to teach the horses to bend, especially when they're just learning their education, to bend laterally right underneath the calf of your leg. And then we transition that into movements such as shoulder in. Okay, because the horse must learn how to bend correctly in order to move in a shoulder in. Otherwise, he'll simply yield to your leg and do a very bad version of leg yield down the rail. Okay, which we see all the time, which is why you should try to practice some of your lateral movements off the rail, just to make sure your horse is true. Otherwise, he might just slip that little outside leg wide and straighten his body and simply yield to your leg and not bend to your leg, okay? So back to these pictures. First, just look at the graphics there on your left. And I want you to look at the lower picture. It's a beautiful, wonderful picture, graphic, I should say, drawn by a brilliant mind, Dr. Deb Bennett. And it basically is explaining the mechanics of lateral bend. There are some very key components that have to happen in lateral bend. Number one, the horse's TMJ must be released of tension. Once that's released of tension, it allows the horse to create what's referred to as a lateral flexion at the pole or the AO joint. This movement. The movement that you want the horse to produce when your instructor says, I want to see the corner of the horse's inside eye. The horse should be able to make this motion simply at one specific joint called the AO joint or the atlanto-occipital joint, okay? Now a horse can produce a lateral flexion there, but the rest of his body can stay absolutely straight. However, what that means is that a horse can produce a lateral flexion at the pole without lateral bending in the body. But a horse cannot produce a correct lateral bend throughout the whole body without also having lateral flexion. It's key. Okay, so lateral flexion at the pole is different than lateral bending through the body. All right, so when a horse bends, he has to soften the TMJ. He has to soften at the AO joint. Then through the middle part of his neck, he'll stay relatively straight, and then he'll soften at the base of the neck. Now notice, even if I'm just sitting here as a biped vertically, if I soften my jaw, find my lateral flexion, release at the base of my neck, can you see that I shifted my weight to the outside legs? Okay. There's one more key area, and that is the area where your leg rests. The horse, to complete a bend, has to do all of the things I just mentioned and soften where your inside leg is. He'll laterally bend there. And as he laterally bends there, his spine will also, let me see if I can show it to you. He'll laterally bend and he'll lift and rotate his body this way. And that's what gives you the appearance of a bend, even though you don't have a lot of motion in a true side bend. So when you're riding on a circle and the horse is truly bending, you will feel your outside hip rise ever so slightly, which is why we tend to want to be sitting a little bit more into our inside seat bone because it's following the plane of the horse's spine, which is why it doesn't make sense to sit on the outside of the back. If you dig into the outside of the horse's back with your seat bone, you're blocking true bend. Does that make sense? Okay, so if my hands are representing the lumbar vertebrae, it has the side the side transverse processes, which is the horse's lower back. If the horse is bending to the left, this is what will happen to the vertebrae, which you can see in the bottom graphic, okay? So you get the release at the pole, at the AO joint, you get the softening at the base of the neck, which starts the process of unweighting the inside legs. You soften where your leg is, the horse will create a side bend through the thoracics and a little bit into the lumbars, coupled with axial rotation, which then allows the horse's inside hind leg to step forward to the midline with a bend and to push himself forward. So this is what we're talking about, your lateral bend, and then when he pushes forward into longitudinal roundness, okay? Does that make sense? Okay.
It looks like we're all on the same page. We're just have a little bit of a question.
Yes.
Can you address the idea of sitting to the inside seat bone without collapsing the rider's side?
Yes. That's an excellent question. As a matter of fact, I'm sitting on this really, really freaking cool chair right now called the QR360. And it was developed by a man named Dr. Turner. And I was actually turned on to it by Denny Emerson. And what it is it's a chair that allows you to have dynamic posture. You see, if you're sitting in a static chair, you're going to be static, okay? If you're static, you're not firing your own postural muscles. Now you can see I tip this to the left and now I tip to the right. I can tip forward and I can tip back. This chair moves. So if you study Feldenkrais, it's a great chair to do something like your pelvic clock on. So when I'm sitting to the inside, now right now you can't see me, but I've just dropped my left seat bone forward and down. But you see my rib cage has maintained its turgor. So what that means is I have to be able to move, like you can't see it right now. I'm moving my pelvis like a belly dancer from right to left, but my upper body maintains its integrity. Okay, so to work on that, I always tell my students that I want you to imagine from the points of your hips to your armpits that each side is the same distance. You see, if I collapse, my left is shorter than my right. And then when people want to make the adjustment, they typically just lift their shoulder, but they don't find it in their own torso or their rib cage. So I love this chair. And this isn't a sales pitch at all, but it has helped my riding enormously. I actually sit on this chair before I get on all my horses. If I ride 4 horses a day, I sit on my chair 4 times a day, just to mobilize my pelvis and to make sure that I am engaging my own postural muscles to keep myself in a good posture. Now, I have the same asymmetries as other people. I tend to slightly collapse to the right and all different kinds of things. But through feedback mechanisms, through our proprioception system, we can make changes. So that was a great question to lead into the next segment of our talk.
You're going to have questions about the chair too. We're going to come back to that.
Is it okay if I just send it to you guys and you can send it out to your membership? Absolutely.
I will include the information in the feedback survey email, everyone.
Awesome. It really is like the coolest chair. And I can get you like a 10% discount. I think my code is Jillian or something like that. I'm not a very good salesperson, but this I really believe in. So I think every rider should have it. It's very similar to the Balamo chair, but it doesn't have as much motion and you can't really get the Balamo chairs anymore. These chairs are actually intended for you to have at your desk. Of course, I have mine down in my grooming area where I tack up my horses. So they're multifunctional. They're not just for riding, they're for everybody to work on their posture. All right, so here we go. So essentially, when horses are moving with healthy spinal dynamics. When horses are slowly educated mentally and physically, they learn these dynamic weight-bearing postures if their spine is healthy and fully mobile, which is one of the primary goals of dressage. It's right there in a nutshell, is to mobilize the body in a way that all the joints have the most range of motion to keep the horse supple, strong, and mobile into their elder years. That's what's so beautiful about dressage. And theoretically, we know these things. And we spend our entire lives learning the techniques to achieve that, right? So these are just an assortment of pictures because I think that when we're learning about theory, it's good to have an image because too often we have bad images in our mind. So I like this collage of pictures because good posture is good posture. Whether it's a dressage horse, a Western horse, a trail horse, a hunt seat horse, an in-hand horse, a gated horse, or a non-gated horse. Good posture is good posture. And when that relates to riding, it simply means that throughout the ages, masters of old and modern day masters understand that horses must learn a particular posture to carry the weight of the rider in a way that doesn't damage his body over time. Okay? Okay. So what are some external influences that we can look to when we're educating our horses? We tend to focus as riders and trainers on one sense primarily, and that is the sense of touch. Everything that we do when we're training our horses is based on touch, based on pressure from our seat, from our leg, from our hands, okay? But the horse receives information from the external environment in so many other ways, okay? And these are all the basic senses that we learned about in grade school, right? The senses are sight, hearing, scent, taste, touch, and one of the most important ones to us is the sense of proprioception, okay? And I'm gonna spend a little time actually discussing what is proprioception, because it's all out there. People are onto it now. It's been talked about for a long time, but there's some confusion around exactly what proprioception is, okay? So I'm just going to quickly talk about how these other senses play a very big role in the education of our horses, okay? And then we're going to end on proprioception. So essentially, I mentioned it in the very beginning, and that is, we always talk about the skeleton, and we talk about the muscles, and we talk about fascia, and we talk about ligaments, and we talk about tendons. But at the end of the day, none of those things work without the brain and without the nervous system. Okay, so I'm going to try to cram and give a short explanation about what the nervous system is on one slide, but you could spend your whole life studying the nervous system. Probably the easiest way for me to explain the nervous system is this. You've got the brain, right? Think about the brain as being New York City. It's like the Metroplex, okay? And coming out of New York City is a major interstate, okay? And that interstate is the horse's spinal cord, okay? And the spinal cord runs through all of the vertebrae, okay? Now, if you have a vertebrae and you look at it, there's going to be a big hole in the middle. And that big hole in the middle is where the spinal cord runs, or that's where the interstate goes, okay? And then off the sides of each vertebrae, there are smaller holes called foramen. And those smaller holes are where a whole bunch of other nerves branch off of the major interstate system. So through these little holes, I refer to those as exit and on-ramps, okay? So you've got your spinal cord and you have a little nerve that's gonna take an exit ramp and it's gonna travel all the way down to stomach land, okay? And once that nerve goes down to stomach land, maybe there's something going on in stomach land and we need to tell some people in New York City. So it's going to take these peripheral nerves on these backcountry roads all the way back up to the major interstate, get on the on-ramp and go to New York City, okay? So I want you to imagine the spinal cord as an interstate. All messages coming to and from the brain must travel on the superhighway, okay? And messages exit and enter the interstate via these peripheral nerves, okay? And the peripheral nerves create an extensive network of back roads traveling throughout the body. It goes to the land of spleen. It goes to the rock of foot. It goes to everywhere, okay? And the body informs the brain and the brain informs the body, okay? So the brain receives messages from the body through nerves located throughout the body, and those are your sensory nerves. It's what the body is receiving from the external environment, information, sends it to the brain interprets the message, and then sends back motor impulses that create movement, okay? So the information travels along the peripheral nerves back to the interstate, entering via on the ramps. The messages travel to and are then analyzed by the brain. The brain responds by sending messages back to the body via the internet through motor nerves. And the motor nerves exit the interstate via the peripheral nerves to tell the bones, muscles, tendons, joints, and the fascia how to respond, okay? All of these parts must be operational to create healthy movement. So if you think about that, you guys, if you say, well, can I create problems by overbending? You disrupt the interstate, right? Oh shit, I have a roadblock. Now I gotta take an exit ramp and try to take a detour to get to the brain. So now all of a sudden I start to have compensations, okay? So we are sitting on this, okay? We are sitting on the supercomputer, okay? And yes, we want the horse to change the shape of the spine, but it can only do so by the information that the nerves are generating to and fro from the brain, okay? Now, how do these peripheral nerves interpret the external environment? Well, they interpret the external environment through our senses, okay? So let's look at the sense of sight. Horses see in a very, very different way than what we do. And so when they spook at things and we get upset, they're not really interpreting or seeing the external environment in the same way we do, because they have two eyes set to each side of their skull, and they see two different images out of each eye. We can't even relate to that because that's not how we see, okay? So the sense of sight determines placement of objects, the size of objects, the shape, the color, and the movement. Okay, so very similar to us. These are the same things that they are visually taking into their nervous system, okay? Now, something very interesting is that, have you ever walked outside and it's a super bright day, and then you walk into kind of a darker area and you can't see anything, and it takes a little bit of time for your eyes to adjust? Well, the same thing happens for horses. However, it takes twice as long for their eyes to adjust as it does a human's, which is why sometimes horses don't want to get on a trailer. They're going from very light to very dark. Or you'll notice some horses will spook when you walk from the outside into the barn and you've got light to dark, a shadow. Or maybe your lights are casting shadows in the arena and they see light to dark. It takes them longer to adjust their eyesight. And what do we typically do when horses exhibit a reaction? We get frustrated or we get annoyed, right? So again, this is a perfect example of, if you understand the horse's body more, you can communicate better because you understand them better. And if you understand them better, you become a more empathetic friend, a more empathetic partner to your horse, okay? Now, horses have blind spots. Horses can't see directly behind them. They can't see directly in front of them, and they can't see under their muzzle. So behind the horse and over his back, he also cannot see. So when you're sitting up on top of him, he can actually not see you, okay? Or if you curl your horse and put his nose on his chest, he can't see, okay? So if he can't see, you take that sense away from him. Then he has to start relying on other senses to override his ability to take in information from the world, okay? So let's look at another one of those. Let's go to how does a horse, before I go to hearing, let's go to, I talked about where he had blind spots. A little bit more about the sight. Horses are very good at perceiving contrast, which is why when you're working with ground poles, you should have a contrast on your ground poles because it makes it very visual for them. A lot of times with, if I'm using a dressage whip, I like to use Linda Tellington Jones's whip, which is white, and I put black electrical tape on it and make it a candy cane because the horse can see it very well. Again, that is how having information about the horse can lend you into a better place because you can implement better training practices to make it easier for the horse. Okay. And the last thing about sight is that horses have to move their heads to judge distance. So if you notice, if a horse gets scared about something, he'll lift his head and he pans the environment. Okay. So when the horse sees something far away, he has to lift his head to see it. If he wants to see something close, he lowers his head to look at it. Okay. Because the horse can only move his eyes from side to side. He can't roll his eyes up and down so easily. Okay, so they adjust their body to see. And you can experience that easily when you're trying to make your horse stand still and he wants to look at something. He doesn't move his eyes, rather he wants to move his body or adjust his body to look at it. Again, and then we get mad at them. So it's just about how they see, okay, and take in information from the environment. Now let's go to hearing. Horses use their ears a lot to tell us about how they're feeling. And it's not really something that we pay that much attention to unless the horse pins its ears, right? If a horse pins its ears, then you're like, oh, stop it, knock it off, this and that, whatever. But there are a lot of little things that happen with the ears that we don't pay attention to that can tell us a lot about how the horse emotionally is feeling, okay? Very frequently, if you're working with a horse and you've got that incredible, magical connection, his ears always turning back on you, listening, a little flicker. He looks away, I say, hey, he flicks his ear to me. He just said, yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I know you're here, but I'm a little, yeah, I know you're still there, right? So they're acknowledging us, okay? So how the horse uses his or her ears can tell us a lot about their emotional state beyond the obvious of I'm annoyed, okay? So the ears are also extremely interesting because they house the horse's inner ear, which is essentially the horse's vestibular system, which governs the horse's mechanisms of overall balance, okay? So I'm sure some of us have had vertigo before, where we've had an ear infection and we're just a little off. We feel foggy, you know. So the ears and the inner ear play a huge role in helping tell the horse where the horse is in time and space, which ties into proprioception, which we're going to look at here shortly. So the vestibular system informs the brain about the position and the movement of the head in relation to the vertical plane. So I'm not going to go through everything that's on this slide, but just realize that the ears are important in terms of indicators of emotion, as well as housing the very fragile and delicate organs of the horse's vestibular system, which plays a huge role in governing their balance. And what are we always trying to help the horses with? Balance. Okay. So we've done sight and we've done hearing. And we've got a couple more here to look at. Smell. Horses use smell to identify their family, their herd members. They use smell to seek out horses and mates. Stallions smell mares, mares smell stallions. When something's new, what does the horse want to do? He wants to smell it. And then we slap him away. No, allow him to use that sense. Allow him to smell, right? They use their smelling to locate feed and water and to sense danger, which is why horses are very nervous on a windy day, because it distorts these senses. They can't tell where the smells or the sounds are coming from. So smell it can be a really wonderful thing to use in your training program. For example, how many of you have heard that lavender is a wonderful thing to bring about relaxation? Well, that's true. We can use smells to bring about relaxation in our horses, as long as that scent is associated with a feel-good experience with the horses. Now, you could put lavender all over your body and take the horse into a scary situation, lose your patience, get too firm, and now the horse is going to associate the smell of lavender with that experience. So if you want to use lavender to bring about relaxation, do it in a way that it is in alignment with a positive experience. So again, here is a way to bring smell into your training program, okay? Just as much as you can bring sight into your training program by having an awareness that their eyes don't adjust, or that they see contrast well, or they might have to lift their head to see far away, right? So they're using these senses to bring in information so that they can make decisions in their brain about what they're going to do in the situation, all right? Taste. I love this picture. It's so cute. The little tongue is stuck out there. But this is a very well-developed sense that's very closely related to smell. Horses can taste sweet, they can taste salty, and they can taste sour. And they use this sense to determine if a food source is safe to ingest. And oftentimes horses will use their mouth and sense of taste and their muzzles and their long whiskers as little neurosensors to feel their way around, right? Their muzzles are like our hands. If you ever had a baby foal, they have like massive whiskers because they don't see real well and they kind of bop around and, I just touched something. I'm too close to something, right? So their sensory organs, their mouth and the way they taste, they want to put you're going to saddle a horse for the first time. He wants to put his mouth on the saddle or the saddle pad. Let him explore. That's how he receives information so that he knows that he's safe. If he knows that he's safe, suddenly you start to work within the parasympathetic nervous system where the horse can then learn, right? We want horses to feel safe and confident so they can learn. If they don't feel safe and confident, they're reactive. They're operating more sympathetically. And in that place, horses will be reactive and not able to learn because they're being reactive. But if they feel safe and confident in their relationship with you and their external environment, and they're more parasympathetic, then they can respond. And that's one of the primary things about good horsemanship is how do you help the horse release the reactiveness and maintain the responsiveness? And sometimes we go too far and we desensitize them. Desensitize is exactly what the word says. They are desensitized. I don't want to desensitize my horse. I want my horse to be responsive, right? That's an important thing, which means that I want my horses to tap into all of their natural senses, okay? And lastly, we have the sense of touch, which is primarily mostly what we use in our communication with horses. And it's a wonderful way to communicate with horses, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Remember, you have all these other different ways of communicating with horses to help them use their body in the way that I talked about in the beginning of the talk. So touch. Horse's skin registers pressure, okay? You put your hands together, you move your hands back and forth or twist your hands or push. Those are pressures, right? These are shearing forces. This is what touch does for the horse in terms of how we communicate with them, okay? So when a horse is touched, they can feel different pressure, they can feel different degrees of pressure, they can feel temperature, and they can feel pain, okay? And as I said, you'll notice that horses touch with their muzzles, and the long hairs there tell them, you know, if it's a safe situation or not. And touch is one of the most powerful ways we can connect and to help sculpt our horses physically and emotionally into the desired postures that we want for our riding horses, okay? Now let's move to the big one, proprioception. We don't think of proprioception as being a sense, but it truly is like the sixth sense, right? You know, we talk about the sixth sense, how do we just know something in our gut, or we just have a feeling? Most of that is based upon proprioception, okay? So what in the heck is proprioception? Proprioception is essentially the sense of movement, is having your own self-awareness about how you're moving. Just like, how do you know you're collapsing? You have to have some other information coming from the external environment to bring awareness to you about how you're moving so you can make a change, okay? So proprioception is the sense of movement. In Latin, it actually means to be aware of self. Self-awareness, okay? So it allows the body to know where it is in time and space. And I'm sure we've all ridden horses that didn't seem to know where their feet are. And that is a scary thing, right? It's very important for horses to have a very well attuned and developed proprioception throughout their body. Okay. It also means it brings a lot to them in terms of their own safety, as well as us as we're riding them. There's nothing scarier than riding a horse without good body awareness. Just like it's unpleasant to dance with somebody who doesn't know where their feet are and they're stepping on you, and it's a disaster, right? So having good body awareness is very important to athleticism and healthy mechanics and ridden posture. Okay, so good proprioception is critical in developing coordinated movements. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to help horses develop coordinated movements and to use itself in a way that's good for his body and mind. Okay, so that's what proprioception is. Now, what are proprioceptors? Okay. Proprioceptors are the organs that bring about proprioception, okay? So proprioceptors are position sensory receptors, which are specialized nerve endings that respond to the senses. So it is nerve endings that take in information from the eyes. It's specialized nerve endings that take in information from smell, from hearing, from touch, okay? They're very specialized. And these proprioceptors are what's responsible for transmitting that information to the brain to adjust the movement to create the postures that we want, okay? So senses, all the senses that we've talked about can be consciously stimulated through training to create neural pathways and body awareness. Therefore, senses, especially proprioception, influence balance and posture. Now, there is an amazing woman who has been talking about proprioception for the last 50 years. She's always been ahead of her time, and her name is Linda Tellington Jones. And Linda Tellington Jones has always said, you need to ride your horses on different surfaces, different footing, on rock, in mud, in sand, in deep sand, up hills, down hills, in water. Give the body stimulus so the body can become more intelligent about where it is in time and space. I know it can be scary to take your horse out of the arena. If you're not comfortable riding, lead him. But give his body the opportunity to experience the natural world. It will only result in him becoming more athletic. Okay, so the most common proprioception input centers, okay? So what that means is there are certain areas in the body that have a tremendous amount of proprioceptors to take in input, okay? And those major centers are the horse's feet, which is why we want to get these horses out in the world, right? Be worldly. Don't be the small town girl who's never, gone beyond your small town and only went to the grocery store and the butcher shop and back home. You don't know what's out there. Be worldly. We want our horses to be worldly, okay? So the feet, we do it here at the farm all the time. We give our horses all different types of surfaces to work on. We give the horses all different types of terrain to work on because it creates more intelligence in the body through proprioception. And if I can do that, I have a more athletic horse, and I have a horse that's better able to shape his posture in the way that I want him to, okay? The next area that has a tremendous amount of proprioceptors, the horse's TMJ. So much of the balance that we have in our horses is dictated by the TMJ. And I don't have time tonight to go into the stomatognathic system and the hyoid and the temporal hyoid joint and all that jazz. Just know that the TMJ and the ability for the horse to move his jaw forward and backwards and from side to side is enormously important in terms of the horse being balanced, and the way that the TMJ takes in information from the outside world. And again, this is very, very abused by these, okay? And by tight nose bands and all different types of things, okay? So the TMJ, it's a hotbed of proprioception, and that is directly and intimately tied into the horse's poll and the muscles in the upper portion of the horse's neck, okay? So that's the upper cervical region. And guess what? These regions are constantly messed with by human beings. So every time you put a halter on the horse, every time you lead your horse from the paddock to the barn, every time you put a cavesson on, every time you put a bridle and a bit on, You are intimately talking to areas within the horse's body that are major centers of proprioceptive input. So be aware. Just have the awareness in your mind when you work with these structures with your horses. So an athlete, human athlete, horse athlete with well-developed proprioception has good coordination, quick reflexes, balance control, and the ability to develop healthy, athletic, weight-carrying postures essential for dressage. It is through the development of these neural pathways that we get the fine motor movement skills. So that when your horse falls on the forehand, it's not going to take you 10 circles or 10 times around the arena to get him rebalanced. But just as he's losing his balance, if he's well developed and you give a little half, he said, oh, I can rebalance. Instead of, I'm on the forehand, and I'm coming off the forehand, and now I'm a little imbalanced, and now I'm on the forehand. I want my horse to go, I'm on the forehand. Oh, I'm imbalanced. Oh, I'm falling. Oh, look, even me sitting on this chair, I'm making all these fine motor movement skills that help me posturally look balanced. One of the best ways for you to experience yourself is if you're standing there, stand up and stand on one foot. And you're going to feel your ankles make all these little tiny adjustments to keep, you might look like you're standing still, but you're doing all these things in your ankle. That's the proprioceptive firing to help you stay balanced while you're standing. It's the very same for the horse, okay? So the development of proprioception is essential to good, healthy spinal mechanics that could then be shaped into healthy riding postures. But again, don't forget those other senses because they all tie into this proprioceptive complex, okay? Body awareness working here. Of course, there are some good things. There's some things we could change here. The horse is a little low in the pole, a little behind, but he's got good spinal dynamics. And as he works him a little bit more forward, you'll see the horse start to elevate through the sling, lower the haunches. And here he's a little low, but there his pole comes up and he gets better and better, okay? Now you might just get enamored by watching those legs, but those legs and what those legs are doing are a byproduct of what he's doing with his spine, okay? And here we start to have a really beautiful picture, all right? And that's all I have for you tonight.
You have kept them quite riveted. You're getting a lot of feedback already in the chat about how wonderful this was. Really appreciate. We definitely got our money's worth out of you today. Appreciate all the time. So I'll just mention that Beth Buchema did some research on a bunch of different chair options. There's some links in the chat and information there. Apparently the brand you had discussed, Jillian, was one of our vendors at the 2019.
Oh my gosh, so wonderful.
So,
well,
yeah.
Put a code in if you want when you'll get a little money off.
Yeah, we can throw that into the follow-up email. So wonderful. Lots of thanks. I'm going to go ahead and pull Iris in here to thank you.
Yeah, Jillian, thank you so much. It was informative and entertaining, and you kept us all really riveted. So thank you. It was really useful. Appreciate your time here. And we'd love to thank everybody who has joined us this evening, a large crowd. Don't forget that Dawn's going to send you an email to get your feedback on this, and we hope to see you next week. Jillian, thank you so much. This was really brilliant.
You're so very, very, very welcome.
It's really great.
Ride the whole horse. Ride the whole horse. All right, ladies, have a beautiful evening. I hope your weather warms up soon.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.